Started. So again, it is Sacraments at a Slant. And tonight's slanted sacrament, as we hinted at last week, is marriage. But I'm not going to use the vaunted clergyman's word for this, but I will show his backside. Just a brief piece of review. I'm not going to do a lot every week, but I think it's important tonight to just do a little bit of review of what we've done the last 2 weeks, because it will really set the stage, I hope, for what we'll be doing for the next 4 weeks. So what we're really talking about all this time is the sacraments. And I used the kind of the catchphrase of "at a slant" because I want to do something that's a little bit beyond what we might do in a confirmation class or something. But sacraments in general, as it says here, taken out of the prayer book, are outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual grace given by Christ as sure and certain means by which we receive that grace. And so grace, according to our prayer book, is God's favor towards us. It's unearned and undeserved. By grace, God forgives us our sins, enlightens our minds, stirs our hearts, and strengthens our wills. And when we think about it in terms of the sacraments that we've already talked about, baptism and the Eucharist, we can easily see that. And now as we move into the other of the 7 sacraments, we just need to keep that in mind, that these are issues or ways that God addresses us, enlightens us, stirs us, and strengthens us. And as I pointed out, or really claimed the last couple of times, the sacraments are outward and visible signs, which means that there's something physical or something material involved. Certainly with water, with baptism, it's water. With the Eucharist, it's bread and wine. With anointing, it's oil. And with marriage, as we'll see, there are a couple of other ones. It may be the sign of a cross, it may be some action, but there's something material that goes on in a sacrament that illuminates or enhances what's going on in our own selves. I think about this, and I haven't mentioned this before, but I think about this in terms of styles of learning. Some of us learn better when we hear something. Some of us learn better when we see. Some of us learn better when we do. So what are the styles of learning? And sacraments add a style of learning, if you will, to what we have internalized. And then 2, sacraments are signs. They're outward and visible signs. They're not magic. Doing it doesn't make it happen. What happens is in your heart, doing the sacrament or being present at the sacrament enhances that, illuminates it. They're visible signs of that grace. And Christ gives us to these as means by which we receive that grace. So the language surrounding those sacraments should illustrate the fact that they are not magic. Baptism, a splashing of water, if there's nothing going on, nothing else going on, a splashing of water is a splashing of water. It's different than the sacramental piece. So in the last 2 weeks, we talked about baptism and Eucharist as signs of grace. And I just love these photos from the Orthodox churches. That baby is the most precious photo of being initiated into something, whether it's shock or delight. Clearly, baptism is being brought into something new and something different. Baptism is initiation into the body of Christ. It's welcome into the church. It is all of those things. And then in the Orthodox tradition, the baby is communed, is given communion immediately after baptism. It's all in one thing. And we'll talk about that when we finish up this session, when we talk about confirmation, because there's some relationship there. But so we talked about baptism being that rite of initiation, and then the Eucharist being a rite of eating. How do we ritualize eating? How do we take that thing that we do every day, but sometimes we do it in special ways. We do it with family and friends in ways that is more than just eating or more than just feeding. It is dining, it is eating, and it is bringing a communal aspect, a spiritual, a social aspect to what we are doing with food. And in the Eucharist, I don't want to say reduce it, but we boil it down in some respects to bread and wine. Those two things that were so essential in the ancient world, we can make equivalents for us today, but I don't think they translate quite as well. But bread and wine in communion, in community, has something special going on about it. And we talked about it in terms of just who do you eat with and who don't you eat with, in terms of the ritual of who's at the table. But also we talked about it in terms of, what is the whole concept of sacrifice, because we talk about the sacrifice of the Mass, and Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. So with communion or with the Eucharist, there are these two things. There's this meal of the people around whom or with whom we gather, but there's also this sacrificial element. We're eating a sacrificial meal. They're intertwined, but you can think about them separately. And so the Eucharist is both and in those ways. And I'll stop here in a second. But and then because it's important, and this was a question that was raised at the first time we were together, and answered it last week, but it's really also important as we move away from the first two sacraments of baptism and Eucharist, those traditionally considered clearly sacraments, dominical ordinances, things that Jesus said we should do, into what some churches, including the Episcopal Church in some ways, call sacramental rites, these other 5 things that we call sacraments. So there's confirmation and reconciliation and marriage and ordination and unction, anointing of the sick. Tonight, we're going to move from those things that are clearly sacraments, those outward and visible signs of inward and spiritual grace, into the category of sacramental rites, which the prayer book describes as those things that evolved in the church under the guidance of the Holy Spirit. And while they are means of grace, they're not necessary for all persons in the same way that baptism and the Eucharist are. So if you think about baptism and Eucharist as sort of the fundamental rites of the church, one brings you into the church, one brings you into the body of Christ, and then the other feeds you as part of the body. Not everyone is going to get married. Not everyone is going to be ordained. Not everyone will want or desire or need the sacrament of healing. Not everyone will go through the rite of penance or reconciliation of a penitent. And as we'll talk about again at the end, the whole question of confirmation, while it is considered a sacrament, is so fraught with controversy that's why I've pushed it off to the end. Give me a little bit longer time to think about it. No, I know what I would say, but also to put it in the context of all of the rest of these. And as I said, at least at the outset or last week, to put confirmation at the end, that being the Monday night before Pentecost, both confirmation and Pentecost have to do with the descent of the Holy Spirit and the gifts of the Holy Spirit. So I thought that would be a good time to consider it, as opposed to considering it a little bit earlier. So stop there for a second and see if anybody has any questions. Unmute yourself if you're muted. Jump in, ask any questions that you have before we move along. And
I have one question going back to the baptism. My son-in-law and I were talking, and we were talking about people who go to Israel and get baptized in the Jordan. I was thinking that that was just more of a symbolic, feel-good thing and doesn't really have any theological meaning if you've already been baptized once.
You are absolutely right.
Okay.
We talked about that a little bit last week, I think, because a similar question came up. Is that depending on the tradition that you're a part of, whether you were raised in it or you became a part of it. If you grew up Episcopalian or Catholic or Lutheran, Methodist, Presbyterian, a lot of times you're baptized as an infant. But if you're part of an Anabaptist tradition, the Baptists, or as I grew up in the Church of the Brethren, you're not considered baptized until you make the choice to be baptized. And so the word Anabaptist means baptized again. And so these 16th and 17th century Christians would say, if you were baptized as an infant, you had no say in that, and you needed to make your own choice. So almost all Christian bodies will recognize other bodies' baptisms with that exception. And they will all say, if you are baptized, you are only baptized once. So to go to the Jordan River and to be baptized again is basically a symbolic thing. You've already been baptized once. It's just using water that's been flowing down that channel where theoretically, Jesus was baptized and John was baptizing and all those kinds of things. It is a symbolic thing. It's not baptism. Theologically, it's not a valid baptism unless you had never been baptized before. Okay. That is a great question. Great question. Anyone else? Okay. So tonight we'll talk about matrimony, marriage. And as we go into this, I just want to sort of remind folks that I'm not going to give an exhaustive history of marriage. There are books and books and books and incredibly long Wikipedia articles and articles in dictionaries and everything else on the history of marriage, even all of the biblical passages that have to do with marriage, both in terms of how it developed or all of those kinds of things. What is the Christian theology of marriage? I don't want to go, I'm not going into all of that. We'll touch on bits and pieces of those things, but we're doing the sacraments at a slant, and I'm trying to highlight the things that I hope will illustrate or enhance our understanding of the sacraments as we experience them, either as participants, as we participate in the Eucharist, or as witnesses, as we witness what's going on in a marriage, for example, for tonight. So, what I really want to do is to contextualize things. But again, as sacraments are outward and visible signs of an inward and spiritual reality or a grace, I want to continually challenge us to see how those outward and visible signs accentuate or give power to that inward and spiritual grace that we experience. So it's not just say, well, this is this, and this, but how does it have an impact on us? How do we have a richer understanding of where all of this came from? And sometimes it's going to be funny, and sometimes it's going to be serious, and the light bulb will go off in our minds, and we'll say, oh, got it. That's really kind of cool. And that makes this so much more meaningful. So that's what I want to do, certainly for all of these, but just as a reminder, that's what I want to do tonight. So I'm going to invite you to unmute yourself and chime in on why do we get married? Why have people over the centuries gotten married?
It's what brings us together today.
Well, yeah, flesh that one out. Stumped you. Why? Come on. Why do we get married?
Love.
Love. Okay.
Commitment. To partner for life. Have
okay.
children.
Hopefully.
All together, which can sometimes be a
We
challenge.
were commanded to do so.
Well, Bruce, I just want to push back on that. What if you're commanded to be celibate? So again,
it depends on which path you want to take.
Well, yeah. So the question is, in terms of these sacramental rites, these last five or these other five, other than baptism and Eucharist, are not necessarily for everyone. So, but the question of celibacy, we'll talk about that in a little bit. But so we've got love, companionship, partnership. What else did I hear?
Commitment.
Okay. But, what's different, why is marriage and commitment? You could commit to your partner in the law firm, right?
Right.
To make sure that you make money,
Right.
or you defend the right people. So what are other reasons?
I'd
Well,
say
to announce to your community that two of you are committed to each other and keeping other people from allegedly trying to interfere with that union.
Okay, so we're at partnership still. What else? I heard somebody else.
I think it was me. Can you hear me, Sue?
Go ahead. Yep.
I think in this day and age, some of it's legality too.
Okay.
If you have children or, money problems or whatever.
Oh, you hit on three of the biggies, and we'll talk about those. So, yeah. What else? Anybody else?
It's a social convention.
Procreate.
So social conventions. What, Kathy?
Procreate.
Procreation. Okay. All right.
I was going to say it's a social convention, which is not necessarily really convention anymore, because I don't know how future generations are going to view this social convention.
Okay. Good. Well, these are all good. One other one?
Tradition.
Tradition. Okay. So we are, what I'm hearing from y'all, and this is fine, are sort of, for the most part, contemporary reasons for why folks get married. But historically, there were a number of other reasons why people got married. Certainly, procreation is one, but you don't have to be married to procreate. We see that all the time, right? So, but in antiquity, certainly that was part of it. But part of it, in terms of procreation, had to do with who's going to inherit. So you knew, if you were married, you theoretically knew, of course, adultery aside, you knew who the father was going to be. If the father and the mother were married, you would make the assumption that the father was the father, the husband, the man in the marriage was the father, and therefore you knew who would inherit. So we've got questions of inheritance here. Certainly, we see this going back to that photo from The Princess Bride, is we're going to bring these two countries together, right? the houses of what was it, Florian and whatever, these two houses were going to be brought together and unite these two kingdoms. But this, taking the political aspect out of it, the joining of two families, the melding of two families would be done through marriage. And we see that, we still see that in even in modernity, not quite as much. Some would talk about, the question of how do you legitimate sexual activity rather than keeping everybody just sort of, like the rabbits in my backyard. How do you legitimate sexual activity? And so marriage became the way of doing that, making sure that people who should and shouldn't be married were. So there are a lot of reasons, and they aren't all necessarily reflected in what we today think about why folks get married. It's not just about doing fireworks on the beach here, and her probably saying, yes, I will, is very different over the course of history. And a lot of it, as we'll see, even as it's spelled out in our own marriage liturgy, have to do with issues of property. Has to do with issues of property. So how do you transfer property from one individual to another? And that has to do with both what happens when you as an individual die, who gets all of what is yours. If you are a landowner, who gets your land? If you are a ruler, who gets your kingdom? So the question of the transferal of property, including inheritance, but other kinds of things, is part of what gets wrapped up in marriage. But also, what happens if you are the father of a daughter in antiquity? That daughter was part of your property. That was part of your household. And so how do you transfer that person, that daughter, that piece of property to another owner, that being the husband? And so this question of transfer of property is critical, and it has to do with the necessity of the heir, if you're going to transfer it down, and that's why you need to know who is the legitimate heir, and marriage helps define all of that. And you see that, in issues of wills and inheritance and all of that, but you also see it in biblical writings and other places, is that what are the penalties due to the husband if the wife is violated? Because your property has then been violated. So, the wife becomes property to the husband, as she was property to the father. And we'll see that as we go on a little bit more. But the question of property is so intertwined with marriage that we don't think about much anymore, and we'll see why that's happened. But we certainly don't think about it. But we pay, I don't want to say lip service, that's not quite right, but we pay homage to it every time we go to a wedding. We pay homage to a lot of these kinds of things. So before I go on, questions, thoughts, other ideas about why we get married or anything like that?
So just to clarify this, in biblical times, a marriage certificate was basically a deed for chattel?
Yep, in many respects, because I thought about adding to this whole evening, and I just decided I didn't want to go that way, is what do issues of divorce teach us about issues of marriage? So in biblical law, a man could give his wife a certificate of divorce. We even hear about this in the New Testament, which meant that she could be married again, without violating the property issues, without violating the marriage issues. So it's there's some what's the word I'm looking for? Some nuances to this, and we'll talk about them in a minute. But basically, yes. When you got married as a woman, when you were married, you left your father's house. For this reason, a man shall leave his mother and a woman leave her home, and they will become something else. And so you move from being part of your father's household to being part of your husband's household. The pater familias. This is Western marriage, okay? Other cultures in other places around the world were matrilineal, mater familias cultures, but I decided I just didn't want to go that direction. Wanted to focus on what was kind of our Western set of assumptions. Answer your question,
Western
Bruce?
slant, if you will.
Yes. Western slant. There we go. Answer your question?
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else?
I don't know, everybody looks pretty serious. All the women on here look very serious when you're talking about them becoming someone's property.
Oh, we'll get to that even more.
I'm having a little trouble with, I understand what you're saying.
Uh-huh.
From back, ancient times.
Yep.
I have a little trouble with it in modern times.
Okay. Yeah, we'll get to that. This is absolutely has very little to do with marriage, and I suppose I could link it there, but your comment about who's looking concerned and all of those kinds of things. Some of you know what I wrote my doctoral dissertation on. I wrote it on eunuchs, not the operating system. And whenever I would read papers at academic conferences, the women were always very interested and the men were always very nervous.
Yeah.
So this all has to do with your point of perspective.
Yes.
So, oh, come on, move. There we go. So there are some outward and visible signs that we use, that we see, we participate in marriage ceremonies and weddings in the West. And so I just raised the question of what are these outward and visible signs of what are the outward and visible signs? And I had a lot of fun kind of looking through some of these things. That ring on the right, since we'll start with rings, is from 3rd century Rome. And it is a wedding ring. And carved in it in onyx are these hands clasped. And we'll talk about that again in a minute. But, so how much, so much had, as I already mentioned, so much had to do with property and what was whose. So rings go back a long, long way, 4,000 years or more. Our earliest examples come from ancient Egypt, and some of them, we've got evidence of this, not necessarily physical artifacts, were braided hemp. There we've got something new for the cannabis industry. We can make hemp wedding rings, but we have evidence that there were hemp wedding rings. They were a circle, and you hear this is in kind of cheesy ways if you go to weddings, but this has a long history that the circle is a symbol of eternity, and it signified perpetual love. So this idea of the ring goes back a long ways. And why do we put a wedding ring on the 4th finger of the left hand? Does anyone know?
It's the heart.
It's the vein, the
It's the
artery and
vein,
vein go
yeah.
to the heart, up the arm and into the heart.
Yeah, exactly. That's what the Egyptians believed, that there was a vein that connected to the heart, and it was called the vena amoris among the Latins.
Love, yeah.
So that goes back 4,000 or 5,000 years.
The Europeans don't use the left hand for the wedding ring. They use the right hand.
Yep, and there are other reasons for that. But, just for us, this left-hand thing. Most of our Western customs about rings and all of that come from Rome and Greece, of course. Originally, they were associated with issues of dowry. We'll come to that in a few minutes, as you see. And then with a promise of fidelity. If you're wearing the ring, you're faithful to the person who gave you that ring. And you can think about that in terms of rings that would be given from rulers to vassals. If you're wearing the ruler's ring, you are, as a vassal, you are beholden to that ruler. One of the things that I found, and I didn't see anybody really tying this together, but in 16th and 17th century Europe, there was a practice known as Gimmel rings, Gimmel, Gimmel rings. And these were rings that were kind of like puzzle rings. I'm sure you've seen puzzles where you've got these rings of metal and you've got to twist them around, and when you get them all together, they form one solid piece. Mm-hmm. Well, in this Gimmel ring practice, the husband or the groom would have one ring and the bride would have another. And at the wedding, the groom would give the bride his ring and they would be twined together, and then the bride would wear that. And I was never able to find a source for why there's an engagement ring and a wedding ring together that we do in the West. But it sounds to me like there may be some precursor in this Gimmel ring ceremony. But the rings go, like I say, a long way back. The clasped hands, as you see here in this Roman ring. We'll talk again, as I mentioned, about the clasping of the hands. That has to do, in some respects, with contractual stuff, but certainly sacramentally, that becomes one of those outward and visible signs, is the joining of hands. We turn to this whole question of giving away. So all of the women who are on this Zoom call who have gone through a wedding ceremony, how many of you were given away? I see Nan raise her hand. Kathy,
Yes, I was.
Carla, Marilyn.
Sue.
Yes. So what was the language there? Who gives this woman to be married to this man? It's a transfer of property. It's a transfer of ownership. And so, whether we like that language or not, that is a reminder of how marriages for a long time were about property and transfer of property. Associated with all of that were issues of dowry. And I'm just going to ask this question because I didn't know this until I did some poking around. Do you know what dowry is?
Payment.
Pardon?
Payment. Here, take her. I'll give you 10 sheep to take her.
Right?
Well,
not really. What else? Anybody else?
Something to do with material things. I think it's something to do with material things, isn't it? A dowry? I don't know.
Yeah. So a dowry, there are three things that get confused. There's a dowry, D-O-W-R-Y. Mm-hmm. There's a dower, D-O-W-E-R. And then there's the bride price. And we tend to confuse all of these. A dowry is what the dad, just use this language, the dad gives to the daughter when she leaves the house to be married. Mm. So it's a transfer of property from the father of the bride to the bride. Okay? So she doesn't get it when he dies, she gets it when she leaves the house. So it's her property, which means that, it's financial security in case her husband dies and she becomes a widow, or her husband runs off. She still has something that's her own, and it may eventually go to her children. That's a dowry. It's something that the dad supplies to the marriage for the daughter's benefit. A bride price is what the groom pays to the bride's parents. This is, I'll pay you this if you'll give me her. All right? And then the dower is what is given by the groom to the bride,
Wow.
which remains hers. Okay? So again, this is all about property, right?
Mhm.
The dad bestows property on the daughter before he dies. That's the dowry. The bride price is the groom giving property or money to the bride's family in exchange for the bride paying for property. And the dower is what the groom gives to the bride for her own use, her own property.
So Gary, is this why Elaine keeps saying what's hers is hers and mine is hers?
Well, it could be what's hers is hers and what's yours is yours. So anyway, but we see this in the Bible too, in some respects, because there are references to these I don't want to say the matriarchs, but the wives of the patriarchs having their own tent. And everything that is in their tent is theirs. That could be the dowry, which the wife's parents gave her. It also could be the dower that the husband gave to the bride. But what's in her tent is in her tent. So what's Elaine's is Elaine's, you know? And you think about it when Sarah is complaining about Hagar. You know, Hagar is making fun of me because Hagar has a son and I don't have a son. And Abraham says, she's yours. Do with her what you want. She's not Abraham's slave. She's Sarah's slave. She's Sarah's property. So, you know, all of this, there is so much here about property issues. And then the last thing I want to mention is just this whole thing about the veil. What do you think the veil is all about?
Wasn't that so that they would see their bride for the first time? Because the veil was not lifted until after the ceremony.
Okay, that's one. That is an explanation. What else?
Arranged marriages kind of thing, you mean?
Well, that could be part of it. Anybody else?
Well, it certainly played a role with Rachel and Leah.
Okay. So one of the oldest, the veil is one of the oldest parts of the bridal ensemble, the bridal coverings and garments and all of that. And it goes way back to Greek and Roman times. And what scholars have seen, you know, studying the text and all that sort of stuff, is that the veil hid the bride from evil spirits who might want to thwart her happiness.
No, my.
Oh, gee.
Jeez.
Okay, you think this is any sillier than some of the stuff that we do? But then also, to just pick up on what Bruce said, it also hid the bride's face from the groom prior to the wedding, because it was bad luck for the groom to see the bride before the ceremony. We still do that, right? We don't do the veil, but there is still a lot of folks who will not, they will say, I will not see the bride before the wedding.
Right.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So this tradition goes back a long ways. And then in Western cultures, certainly as Christianity took hold, it was used as a symbol to symbolize modesty before God, obedience, all those kinds of things. And if the veil is white, chastity, you know, to make sure that your property is unsullied, right? All of that. So all of these things, so these are not necessarily outward and visible signs of any kind of grace. These are outward and visible signs of the transfer of property from one place to another, from one owner, one overseer, or whatever to another. All right? Any questions or thoughts on that? Brickbats?
It doesn't sound very holy.
Okay.
Where's the holy matrimony?
Okay. Right. And so one of the things that I want to do in all of this, in this whole series, is to say what we do and what we call sacraments have a long history in terms of human relations. And how does the church interpret or reinterpret these as signs of God's grace? Okay. So
Gary, isn't it as society evolves that we change the meaning of what those sacraments or sacramental rites are supposed to be imbued for?
I would say that the short answer to that is yes. We bring new experiences, new ideas, new realities to things that have been done for a long time. So go back to issues of initiation. What does Christianity do with rites of initiation? What does Christianity do with sacrificial meals, with meals of commensality meals with whom you eat? How do we reinterpret that to say that these become ways that God speaks to us? And so that's what we're talking about here. And we don't see it, it's not sequential. It's not like, well, then they did this, and then they did this, and then they did this. It's kind of like there's a melding of things. It's like mixing two liquids and then coming out with a third thing, rather than saying, well, we're done putting the oil on the salad and now we're going to put the vinegar. Doesn't work that way. Oil and vinegar have to be mixed to make that third thing before it works with the salad. So how do we progress with our understanding of what these very, very human ways of dealing with our relationships, how do we progress and understand God acting in those? And that's how sacraments and sacramental rites become real to us, I would say. Okay. So just to take this yet a little bit further, early Christianity, and I'm not going to go through a whole history, as I said, I'm just going to make some pointers. Early Christianity really reflected what was going on in antiquity. And this is a great example in some respects of what you were talking about, Bruce. We don't have the idea of betrothal. That sort of went away, quite a while ago. But in antiquity, betrothal was the thing, and we have evidence of it from St. Ignatius of Antioch and from Tertullian, who, if he would not have gone really extremist, would probably be St. Tertullian. But he became kind of a bizarre extremist. But and again, think as we talk about betrothal, this is a promise or a contract to marry. And it could be between individuals or it could be between families. It's a contract. It is not engagement. Engagement is an appointment. So betrothal is the contract to marry. Engagement is, yeah, we've set the date. We don't see that in modernity in quite this way, but in antiquity, this was that sort of distinction. So Ignatius of Antioch, this is the 2nd century. So Jesus has been dead 100 years, and Ignatius says in his letter to Polycarp, another early Christian thinker, he says, you can't get married, you can't be betrothed without the bishop's knowledge. So all of a sudden, the church is involved. And Tertullian, so Ignatius was in Antioch, was in Syria. Tertullian was in North Africa, century later, both in a letter or in a document called the Apology, sort of trying to state Christianity's validity to non-Christians, but also in a treatise called On the Veiling of Virgins, talks about marriage customs. And he mentions the giving of earnest money, that the marriage would take place. So this is in terms of betrothal. There was a ring given, and that ring, and this goes back to what we were saying earlier, the ring was used, it was a sealing ring, it was a signet ring. And the ring was given to the bride so that she could seal household contracts. She was in charge of the house, and her seal on the contract, made that legitimate for the household. There was dowry promised. Tertullian talks about the veiling of the woman. Doesn't say why. And then going back to that ring from a couple of slides ago, that ring, their hands were joined, and a kiss was exchanged. This is all during the betrothal. This is not the wedding. This is the betrothal. And then at the wedding, or at the nuptials, Tertullian goes on to say, this is when there was a Eucharist and a blessing. So all of a sudden, it's at the nuptials that religion gets brought into this pretty much secular, contractual, property-ridden rite. Okay? So there's this distinction that gets made when the church comes into it, and that being the Eucharist and the blessing. And we'll talk about that again a little bit further. And then John Chrysostom in Asia Minor in the 4th century, this sort of is more on the Eastern side, talks about the man being given a crown at a wedding. And if you go to Eastern Orthodox weddings, even now, there will be a crown that the Orthodox men will wear at weddings. So much of what we do at weddings, with the exception of the crown, has centuries, millennia of background. The giving and receiving of rings, dowry, hands being joined, kisses being exchanged. All of this goes back thousands of years. And what the church has done has overlaid that with an understanding that is specifically Christian. And different Christian groups do this a little bit differently. And so right now I'm going to move to what the Episcopal Church has kind of done with this. But again, I want to stop and see if there are any thoughts or any questions.
Gary, was not the Hebrew church involved in the early weddings pre-Christendom?
Not in quite the same way. Certainly there's really nothing in Scripture that talks about what marriage ceremonies looked like. What was involved, all of those kinds of things. Certainly questions, you can infer that issues of property were involved, that as I mentioned earlier, that wives became part of their husband's household. Laws about the violation of wives were really relatively similar to violations of other property. So if somebody killed your ox and somebody killed your wife, there were issues of payment to the husband for the loss of property. So a lot of these things in terms of the background concepts are there, but the ceremonial aspects, at least in biblical times, in sort of Old Testament Hebrew Bible stuff, there's nothing in any of that spells any of that out.
So basically, more or less, it was all secular and not any religious overtones until Ignatius of Antioch and further on.
Well, certainly in the Christian side, I don't know how how Jews in the 2nd or 3rd century approached marriage in quite the same way, but at least in terms of Christianity, and actually this will be a nice segue into the next section. how the church was involved in weddings through what are sometimes called the Dark Ages and the Middle Ages is a little up and down. It's uneven. Again, there's not particularly a straight line until we get closer to the end of the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, Reformation, modernity period. So I want to shift direction just a little bit here. This still really harkens to the question of property, because we're talking about contracts. Marriage is a contract. And even if you go back to betrothal, in what we saw with Tertullian, you know, there's money paid that says that this is actually going to happen. That's a contract. The betrothal was a contract. And so, you know, what is necessary, even today, for a contract to be valid? And I talk about this. I've talked about this a lot with all of the couples that whose weddings I have performed, because, you know, a marriage is a contract. You who have gone through marriages know that you have to get a license. There are all sorts of secular things that you have to go through to be able to get married legally, right? Legal this is all this marriage stuff. And so what is required for a contract? Anybody, you know, if you've done any legal training at all, you know that there are two things that are required for any contract to be valid. You have to have ability to enter into the contract. You have to know what's necessary to be able to fulfill what the contract says you need to fulfill. And so in terms of weddings or marriages, you have to be old enough to know what you're getting into. This gets bent a lot. This got bent a lot in terms of, in the West, in terms of families, you know, sort of arranging contracts of marriage before their children were old enough to know what was going to go on. But that's, you know, that's that goes back to the parents knew what was going on. The property, it wasn't so important for the property to know what was being done with it. But those who entered into the contract knew what was going on. This becomes important a little bit later when not all marriages were arranged. But it also requires that you know that you have the mental capacity to enter into the contract. That, you know, so again, when marriages are arranged between families, the arranging families have the mental capacity to do that, whether or not the individuals who are being married do. But if you think about this now, in contemporary circumstances, we'll get to this again a little bit further on, is, you know, if you've got a child whose mental capacity is diminished in one way or another, how does that factor into their ability to enter into a contract, into the contract of marriage? And generally what we do in these cases is we have a guardian or some other kind of caregiver give that consent on, you know, say, we are able to do that on behalf of this person. Other issues that relate to your ability to get married are whether or not you're already married, right? You can't enter into bigamy, at least in the modern West. Polygamy in antiquity was different than bigamy. You could have multiple wives. Why? Because you needed to establish a male heir to pass the property down, right? And so as long you had to have these heirs. Well, you know, what was Henry VIII's issue? He had to have a male heir, you know, so he couldn't do polygamy, so he did serial monogamy. Just that he didn't divorce them, he just chopped off their heads, you know. It was, you know, but we had to not have that pre-existing marriage. We cannot enter into bigamy. And then certainly from the Middle Ages on, there were prohibited degrees of kinship. You couldn't marry your sister. You know, what were those degrees? What was the degree of separation before you could get married? Was it first cousin? Was it second cousin? There were certain levels of ability that you could enter into the contract of marriage. And then the other requirement for entering into a contract is consent. You cannot be forced into a contract. Otherwise, it won't stand up in a court of law, right? So, and what this does is that it basically says shotgun weddings are not legal. They are not legal weddings. You were forced into signing a contract that you did not agree to, and so the marriage is not valid. And I don't want to go into questions of annulment in sort of Roman Catholic theology, marital theology, and all of that. That's just kind of beyond what we have time for. But the two basic requirements for entering into a contract is, are you able to enter into the contract, and do you want to enter into the contract? That makes sense? Mm-hmm. Any questions before I get to bands? Okay.
What?
Can I read the screen?
Publishing requirements for contracts, ability, consent, publishing bans.
The bans. Okay. So.
Can't read.
Publishing the bans. How many of you have heard of publishing the bans?
Yes.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, a few of you. All right. So the word ban, B-A-N-N, and yes, I did spell it correctly, comes from the Middle English word meaning proclamation. And so what this publishing the bans, the proclamation in some parishes or places, I'll just use England as an example here, the priest would say, I publish the bans of marriage between John of the parish of, I don't know, Westminster, and Jane of this parish. If any of you know cause or just impediment why these persons should not be joined together in holy matrimony, you are to declare it. This is the first time of asking. And then the next week it would be, this is the second time of asking. And then the next week it would be the third time of asking. And so the publishing of the bans was a way that the parish priest would find out if there was any impediment, as that language goes. You know, is this person able to get married? Is this, you know, is there another spouse out there? Is this person old enough? Does this person have the mental capacity? There is a whole month that goes on of asking in the parish. Do you know any reason why these people shouldn't get married? And if you go to some churches, even on the East Coast today, you'll see these leftovers of what were known as the banns boards. And they'll be in the back of the church, and it will say the banns board, and then there will be the name of the bride and the groom in this slot on the banns board, kind of like the hymn board, you know, and the first week of asking, the second week of asking, the third week of asking. And the assumption is, if you've gone through 3 weeks of asking this, there's nothing hidden, that we know that these people can get married. Okay, so there are these contractual necessities that that spin out in terms of what's going on in marriages. All right. Questions before I move to marriage in the Episcopal Church?
Let's stop. I can remember, I seem to remember bands being published in like the bulletins.
Yeah. I can remember seeing those too.
Yes.
That if there wasn't a bands board, or if somebody wasn't putting them up in traditional parishes, they would be put in the bulletin. Yeah, exactly. I remember that. Anybody else?
This is like a precursor to public notice.
Yeah, exactly.
A more secular thing, but if you want, for example, my grandmother, when she divorced her husband who abandoned her and was gone, couldn't even be found, she had published notices
Right, right.
to legally separate herself from him and get the divorce.
When Elaine and I got married, we did have our banns published in the Anglican Church in Vancouver, Canada. And Elaine's good friend was sitting down next to her on the third reading of the banns, and he leaned over and said, "I could make your life somewhat difficult right now," and she poked him with her elbow.
Okay, we'll get to that in a minute, just a second. So, in the Episcopal Church, and yes, that is me,
Oh, wow.
many, many years ago.
Yeah.
What a gorgeous picture.
And we were married as Episcopalians, full nuptial mass. So when we think about how this translates into our marriage rite, and I love going through this when I'm talking to couples, because they have no clue what all of this is all about, right? They just want to get married. And so in our marriage rite, we address all of these things that we've already been talking about in ways that you may or may not sort of remember or recognize. So at the beginning, of course, in a wedding, there's a whole introduction as to why we're going to get married, and we'll talk about that again in a moment. And then right after the introduction, into this holy union, I'm reading from the prayer book here, into this holy union, so-and-so and so-and-so now come to be joined. If any of you can show just cause why they may not lawfully be married, speak now, or else forever hold your peace. This is the last
I don't
asking.
think they did that.
This is the last
In our
asking.
wedding. Did he? I don't remember.
Deb, just so you know, you're not muted, but
Oh,
this is the last asking. So you've asked, the bands are the first three, and this is the last time. And I always tell the couple that this is a question of legality. This is not, oh, he jilted me, or he was a jerk, or, you know, she left me for another guy. You know, this is a question of legality. This is the last of the bands. And once I explain that to the couple, they say, oh, that's kind of cool. I like that historical piece. Let's go on with that. And then I ask the couple, I require and charge you both here in the presence of God, that if either of you know any reason why you may not be united in marriage lawfully, and in accordance with God's word, you do now confess it. Are you married to somebody else? Do you have something else in your background that you haven't already told me, that somebody else, you know, this is a question of perjury. Are you going to put yourself in a position where you might perjure yourself? These are legal questions. This is all about legality, okay? This is about being able to enter into the contract. And then the prayer book makes it very clear. The next section, the heading of the next section in the prayer book is the declaration of consent. The second aspect of contract, right? So-and-so, will you have this man to be your husband, to live together in the covenant of marriage? Will you love him, comfort him, honor and keep him in sickness and health, forsaking all others? Be faithful to him as long as you both shall live. Will you? This is a question of will. This is a question of desire. Will you do this? Do you want to do this? And, you know, each party answers, I will. It's both, it's an action of will. You know, consent comes from our will, right? So it's not, well, I will because dad's got his gun at my back. You know, you are consenting to this. And so these consensual and ability pieces of entering into the contract are there embedded in our marital, or in our marriage rite. And the Book of Common Prayer's service for marriage goes back to the 16th century. It is the thing that has changed the least in all of the prayer book. And of course, when when North America was colonized, we'll put it that way, the English language that came to, the English language rites for marriage that came here were primarily those that came with Anglicans. And so even if you go to Presbyterian weddings or Methodist weddings or congregational weddings, all of the English language marital rites sound pretty much like the Book of Common Prayer, because that was just sort of the history. We move from the ability and consent. We asked the congregation to affirm that. That was added in this 1979 prayer book. Then there's some religious stuff, the reading of the lessons and a sermon. And then we get into the marriage proper. And the marriage proper is the vows. And so here are the terms of the contract, right? So we've established ability and consent. And now here are the terms of the contract. I will be with you in better, for worse, for richer, for poorer, in sickness and health, to love and to cherish until death do us part. These are the terms of the contract. We've established that you can enter into it, and now this is what you're committing to. And then we do the rings. The rings and the joining and the giving and receiving of rings and the joining of hands is where the marriage happens. So you've heard this language more than once. Now that John and Susie have given themselves to each other by solemn vows, joining of hands, and the giving and receiving of rings. So here's all this outward and visible stuff, right? I pronounce that they are husband and wife, and in Christian marriage, in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Okay, so here all of this joins together to bring this marriage not just as being a civil contract, but something that is beginning to look like Christian marriage. All right? Then there's some prayers, and it concludes, if there's Eucharist, there can be Eucharist or not. And then it concludes with this solemn blessing over the couple, which really is the stamp, the sacramental stamp on what then becomes Christian marriage. But the sacrament, the outward and visible sign, are the giving and receiving of rings and the joining of hands. Those are the signs of the sacrament in a marriage. Okay? Any questions, thoughts? Okay, so why get married? And this goes back to some of the answers that you gave earlier. Many of those answers had to do with love. They had to do with commitment. They had to do with declaring to other people, a particular kind of relationship. We don't talk about getting married for reasons of property. We don't talk about getting married for reasons of inheritance. We don't talk about marriage for all of those kinds of things. We talk about marriage for issues about relationships. And those are reflected now in the rite that we have in the prayer book. So why do we get married? The union of husband and wife in heart, body, and mind is intended by God. Why? For their mutual joy, for help and comfort given one another at various times, and for the procreation of children and their nurture in the knowledge and love of the Lord. All right? This is why we say, as Christians, as Episcopalians, this is why people get married. Joy, comfort, and procreation. In the Catechism, what is holy matrimony? Holy matrimony is Christian marriage, in which the woman and man enter into a lifelong union, make their vows before God and the church, and receive the grace and blessing of God to help them fulfill their vows. So here is where it becomes a sacrament, is that in the context of doing things within the church, the couple receives grace and blessing to help them fulfill their vows. So all of this is a result of changes in society where our property concerns are less, where our procreation concerns are less related to passing down property and those other, working in the fields and all those kinds of things are less, and where religion is less a consideration. The prayer book reflects these changing realities. And our theology has changed a little bit too in all of this, that theology is less about contractual things and more about fulfilling issues of relationship, that our relationships with one another reflect the relationships between God and us, but also the relationships within the Godhead, within the persons of the Trinity, which is this sort of dance of relationships. Thoughts or questions before I move to the end? Thanks,
Gary?
Yep.
In everything that we've read and in the Testaments and in the BCP, it talks about marriage between man and woman. But what about in today's society, women and women, men and men?
We're getting there. So,
hey, how is that a segue for you? Okay.
Thank you. I'll send you your $5 tomorrow. No. Recent developments. So there are two recent developments, relatively recent. I'll put it that way. One is a rite in the prayer book. It starts on page 433. It's called the blessing of a civil ceremony. So what happens if you go and get married by the justice of the peace at any point, and then you want this marriage blessed? And what this does is that it recognizes a couple of realities. One is you may not be in a place, or the timing may not be right to have a church wedding. But the other one is that there's a recognition that a marriage is both a religious and a civil, or as I've been putting it, contractual arrangement. So some of you may know that, let's say in France, if you want to get married, you go to City Hall and you get married, and you're married. That's fine. And then if you want, you can go to the church and the church will bless the marriage. What we've done in the United States or in America is we've melded the two of these things, and clergy for a long time were given the privilege of acting as a civil magistrate in terms of witnessing the contractual obligations that the couple has bound themselves to, right? So the marriage license, is a contract, and there have to be witnesses to that contract. And I, as a clergy person, was given the right to be the magistrate to witness that. It's not the laws in Colorado, and it hasn't been for a while. It has nothing to do with same-sex marriages. But, so the separation of the civil side and the religious side are reflected in this blessing of a civil ceremony. I've done a couple of these. One was with a woman who was from Australia, and she was emigrating to the United States. And she and her husband, for reasons of green cards, got married in a civil ceremony. And they wanted me to do a religious ceremony that looked everything like Princess Diana's wedding. There are a lot of things to say about this particular ceremony. It was a lot of fun. But so I had to make the whole thing look like a real wedding, even though they were already married and none of the family knew it. The second one was a ceremony between a couple who had been living as common law husband and wife for like 10 years, but he had been married 3 times, I think, before they got together. And so I was not able to get permission from the diocese to do their wedding. And what the diocese told me was, have them to go get married by a justice of the peace, and then you can bless the union. and that way you are not part of their contract. So all of these things are really sort of lumped together. But then, getting to your point, Bruce, that of same-sex marriage, and we may have some time to look at what the rite now looks like. But the Episcopal Church, its General Convention in 2012, overwhelmingly approved the church developing a liturgy for the blessing of same-sex unions. Same-sex unions. This was in 2012. And as distinct from marriage. Same-sex marriage was not legal in the United States at that point. But the church recognized that people, same-sex, wanted to make that kind of commitment to one another that heterosexual couples were able to make. And so we approved developing this liturgy. 3 years later, at General Convention in 2015, so these happened in July of that year, the convention approved for trial use. We're going to use these and we may tinker with them until we finally approve them. 2 marriage liturgies. One was kind of an adaptation of what we had in the 79 prayer book, and one was its own liturgy, a little different from the one in the prayer book. That was in July of 2015. I missed a step. In October of 2014, so 10 months earlier, 9 months earlier, Colorado recognized same-sex marriage. So, the government, civil government, recognized same-sex marriage as possible in 2014. And I remember the first wedding I did after that law had changed. Down in the bottom, it didn't, where people had to sign things, it didn't say bride and groom. It said party number 1 and party number 2. The language on the printed form had changed. And that was probably only 2 months, maybe in November, December of 2014. So in 2015, General Convention approved for trial use 2 marriage liturgies. And then on the first Sunday of Advent in 2015, November 29th of 2015, marriage was allowed for Episcopal clergy to perform marriages of same-sex couples. And then at General Convention in 2018, those trial use liturgies were approved and have now been published. So that's the history of sort of the last 8 years in terms of what the Episcopal Church has done. The picture that I've given you there, you see me with less hair performing the wedding of Morgan and Katie in Breckenridge. This was the first and so far only same-sex wedding that I have done. It was probably the most emotional wedding I have ever done from my standpoint. To be there, to be with them. They both came from very conservative Southern families who were all there at the wedding. It was absolutely amazing. But, and I don't want to stick there, I want to go back to all of the rest of what we've been talking about. Because so many of the things that have formed our marriage ceremony came up for discussion as I was preparing to perform their wedding. Who walks who down the aisle? If you think of a traditional wedding, the father of the bride walks the bride down the aisle so that the father of the bride can give the bride to the groom. If you have a same-sex wedding, who walks whom down the aisle? Who is given away. Our language in the prayer book now offers some alternatives. Who presents this woman? Who presents these two people to be married to each other? It's less about property and about families being melded. But it was such an interesting conversation to have with them. They hadn't even thought about it as they were entering into their own wedding ceremony, you know. And as it turned out, both dads walked both of the women down the aisle. It was absolutely astonishing for me to be there, and probably one of the 5 highlights of my ministry as an ordained priest. So, things have changed. Our theology has changed about what is going on in terms of marriage. Our theology has changed in terms of what we see God blessing. Is God blessing the possibility of procreation, or is God blessing the enrichment of people's lives through their commitment to one another? So our theology has changed, society has changed, and our practices have changed. We don't have time, but I could show you some of how the language has changed in the rites for same-sex marriage, or for all of marriage. A heterosexual couple could use these new rites as well. Nothing's specific to same-sex weddings. So, but there I'm going to stop and see if there are any last questions. I realize we're at almost 8:30, and I want to. These go longer than I expect.
Thank you, Gary, for your patience and your acumen on that.
Yep, thanks, Bruce.
Is same-sex marriage still option for each diocese by its own?
In 2018, yeah, thanks, Nan. Good question. In 2018, the Episcopal Church said that same-sex marriage is part of the Episcopal Church, but they made provisions for clergy who, for theological reasons, would disagree with that, so that those clergy could refer the couple to another bishop and or another priest to do that, okay? Even in their own church. So if for example, somebody came to me and said, a couple came to me and said, we want to get married at Good Shepherd. And I said, I have a problem with that, but I know somebody who will do it, and I'll get that person to come in and do it. And they would do it at Good Shepherd with my blessing. Okay. So yeah.
The reason it came up because I was in North Alabama at the time this all came up, and it was a major.
Oh yeah.
There, and it was diocese wide. It was not allowed within the diocese. Period.
Yeah, and there has been a forget which diocese. One of the dioceses in New York, Central New York, Upper New York, or something like that. The bishop said he wasn't going to go along with this. He wasn't going to do it at all. And so he was put on trial by the House of Bishops because he was not conforming to the doctrine of the Episcopal Church. So this is the Episcopal Church's doctrine, and not a particular bishop's. There were allowances made for this to happen, even in dioceses where the bishops may disagree. They have to figure out how to make it happen. So yeah, this is the doctrine of the church. This is not, and if you disagree with it, you can go through channels to deal with that, but you cannot say it cannot happen. Okay.
When did that change from being optional to being mandatory? When was it actually, when the change actually take place in the church?
Yeah, that was in 2018. That was.
It was 18, okay.
The last convention. Yep.
Gary, that's Albany. That's the Diocese of Albany.
Yeah. I knew it was one of those. I just couldn't remember which one, but thank you, Karen.
Right.
I wanted to make a comment that I think it's great in the Episcopal Church that there's room for change, and that we're not stuck in, well, it always was like this, and if we change, that means we're saying they were wrong. But there's room for movement.
Yeah.
And I like that with the Episcopal Church.
Yeah, I think there are two things about that. There's a humility that says we may not have been right before. And on the other side of that is that God works with us as we move forward. And, you know, God is leading us into a new world. It's not just God is asking us to stay in some other place. So yeah, exactly. Thank you, Carla. Anyone else?
Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank
Yes,
you all.
thank you.
Thank you.
This
That
one
was
actually
great.
got recorded. The whole thing. So, anyway, so next week we will talk about ordination. And just as a teaser, this is a question of how do we select leaders? This is this is a universal human question. Who leads us? And that's and what do those leaders get to do? And what are they not able to do? And how do we do that? So that's the issue really at stake next week as we talk about ordination. All right?
Fantastic. Look forward to it.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all. Have a good evening.
Next time.
Mary,
Thank
make
you
sure
so
that you
much.
have decaf for all of us next Monday.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
Good night.
Good night, all.